This episode of All About the Gear is brought to you by BorrowLenses.com, who also provided the equipment we're reviewing today.
All right, folks, welcome back to another edition of All About the Gear. My name is Frederick Van Johnson, here along with the amazing silver-haired Mr. Doug K. over there, who, freshly back from Cuba, has a Sony A7 Mark II in his hands. And yes, this is the latest addition to the A7 series that Sony started last year with the A7, then followed it with, or actually started with the A7, the A7, the A7R, and then they introduced the A7S, which was the amazing low light sensitive camera, and now the latest iteration is the A7 II. So we're going to find out all about this camera. Doug, let's start with, what's the name of this thing? I've seen it written as Sony Alpha Mark II Mark II A with a lowercase a, uppercase A. What is the name of this camera?
Okay, so we went to Sony to get the answer to this, and it is officially the Alpha 7 II, or Alpha 7II. That is the official name of the camera, and we can call it whatever we want, but on record, that's what it is.
So do you write out Alpha, or do you represent Alpha with a lowercase a, or what?
So far, I've been using A, although just to make you happy, I tracked down an alpha character and put it in our show notes. We'll see what happens moving forward.
Note to Sony, can you let us know what you name your cool cameras as you release them?
And stay away from the Greek, will you?
Yeah, come on. You know, no one can find those characters. All right, so let's talk about the basics of this thing. Like I said in the little intro there, so this is the latest in the A7 line of cameras, which is, I would imagine, been going like gangbusters for Sony. So they're riding a good thing there. What are the basics of this thing?
Yeah, and you're right. First of all, you got the camera line exactly right. I'm very impressed. The A7 II, or the Alpha 7 II, is a replacement for the original A7, Alpha 7.
Yeah.
And that's a look at it right there without a lens on it. And it's a really nice camera. It is a refinement. As you pointed out, it's only been a year since Sony came out with the original Alpha 7. But Sony is not afraid to update these things. This is the fourth one in that series, and of course we're expecting to see updates to the other models as well. The high resolution version, the Alpha 7R, and the high ISO version, the Alpha 7S. So the basics of it is that they have, as I said, really refined it quite a bit. Here's an example. Let me put these side by side here for those who are watching the video. So here is, we can see those properly. Yeah, sort of. Okay. So you've got on the left is the new Alpha 7 II, and on the right happens to be my Alpha 7S, but the S, the R, and the original 7 are all the exact same size. So what you're seeing here is a more robust body. It's the same height that you can't tell from that shot. It's the same width, but it is thicker. The camera is quite a bit thicker and quite a bit heavier. It's about, let me look at the notes here. Well, I don't have the notes on that exactly, but it's a heavier, much more robust camera.
It's looking more and more like a DSLR to me.
Yeah, and you're right. Well, it feels like it. It feels rugged. It feels strong. It feels like a really solid camera, and that's something that we didn't have so much in the original Alpha 7 line because they were more in that mirrorless vein, and we're starting to get away from the idea of thinking of mirrorless as being all about smaller and lighter, because now mirrorless is really more about being better. So I think they don't have to use size and weight as an excuse anymore for their cameras. They can stand on their own.
Yeah. Now is the Alpha 7 Mark II weather sealed?
It's got some weather sealing. All they did really is they added a little weather sealing to the battery door, very little. It's got a slightly better weather sealing, but I think what they've done is that the buttons and dials in general are fairly well weather sealed to begin with. I've had my A7R and an Alpha 6000 in Iceland in the rain, and it did quite well actually. So, moderate weather sealing. I should point out. Let's talk about the price for a second.
Yes.
This guy here is a $1,700 camera. It's cost $2,000 with the kit lens. It's again pretty much exact same sensor. I think it is the same sensor as the original Alpha 7. So it's 24 megapixels. It's a full frame camera. But the big thing here is it has in-body image stabilization, which we'll talk about quite a bit.
Which is a really big deal. I was first introduced to, this sort of magical in-body image stabilization when I jumped into mirrorless, and that was with the Olympus OM-D E-M1, and I was blown away that was even possible. And that image stabilization is one of the things that kind of pulled me into learning more about mirrorless, because I was thinking, okay, if they can do that kind of magic, what else can they do? So, and I'm anxious to hear what you thought about it in this body as well.
Yeah, it's this image stabilization is great. It is. I couldn't do them side by side. I didn't have an Olympus camera with me, but my impression is that this image stabilization is not quite as good as what you get from Olympus, but it is quite good. And for those people who need it, and that's not everybody, it can make quite a bit of difference.
Isn't Sony like a gigantic investor in Olympus? Why don't they just say, hey, give us that technology?
Yeah, Olympus got into financial trouble. 3 of their executives are still in jail, I think, for lying about their books. Sony had to come in. They were one of the vendors who invested a total of about 17% in Olympus. And they've had partnerships for a while, but what we're hearing is that this technology is actually totally Sony developed. They did not use the image stabilization from Olympus.
Very cool. Okay, I'm anxious to hear about it. Well, you talked about the sort of the ergonomics on the body and the controls of this. Let's dive a little deeper into because that's what people want to see. They want to, as much as you can get into that in a video online on YouTube. Give us a kind of an indication of how this thing feels in your hands.
Feels really good. So the grip is deeper, right, than the old camera. Take a look at that. The old grip was a bit shallow by comparison. If I can get out of my way,
it's much more Nikon-like, it seems.
Yeah. So here's this little funky little grip. Now there's a nice deep grip, so it's really comfortable to hold. They moved the shutter button from here out to here, which helps quite a bit. The body has a lot more magnesium alloy in it, so it's stronger. The lens mount, this piece here on the camera, the flange, has been strengthened. Sony Alpha 7s all had a problem with their flanges, and the lenses were a bit wobbly. In fact, Photodiox and some others came along and made a replacement flange that I put on my A7R, but this one has a much stronger flange, and the lenses do not wobble at all in there, which is really nice.
Wow.
Other than that, because it's thicker, the thickness, of course, is because of that image stabilization, which takes up a lot of space. And you get a little few changes. They added another button up on top here. There was originally just one. Now there are 2. And these buttons here where it says menu and C3 are at a slight angle because of the thickness of the body. But other than that, it's pretty much the same thing, just a heavier, bigger brother of the old one.
Yeah. Now, a couple of things I'm going to ask about this. Well, first is folks notoriously complained about the battery life in the A7 series. I know you haven't been with that one that long to run it through that many paces, but have you seen any indications on that being improved?
Yeah, and I've had it long enough to discover that this is substantially worse on batteries than the original Alpha 7s. And
I think worse? How could it be worse?
Well, no, the Alpha 7s are not too bad. I mean, they're not as bad as many of the cameras that we test, but this is now what I would say is a 3-battery camera for all-day shooting. I think that's because of the image stabilization. If you've got the image stabilization turned on, it's going through batteries relatively quickly, and I would definitely take 3 batteries for a long shoot. Again, a lot of people complain about that, but the batteries are small. I'd rather carry spare batteries than have a bigger battery that's heavier. It
Yeah,
doesn't
that's a
bother
whole
me too
other
much.
conversation because like I said before, I've seen some batteries, like on the GH3, GH4 that just go like the Energizer Bunny with his, with his drum all day long, and that's not light shooting. That's like heavy shooting and recording 4K video, playing it back, chimping, all that stuff, and it just goes on and on, almost scarily long. Like it can't be still giving me power. So I wonder if whatever they're doing, give some of that to Sony,
Okay.
so that
Well,
these cameras, which are so good in so many other areas, they just fall down on battery.
well, consider that the couple of things. One, that those Lumix cameras do not have in-body stabilization. And even
Right.
compared to the Olympus, let's remember the mass of this sensor. Remember, they're wiggling around the sensor. The sensor's got to
Yeah.
jiggle in order to do this stabilization. And this sensor is more than 4 times the mass of a Micro Four Thirds sensor. So
Mm.
you'd
Yeah.
expect it to use more than 4 times the energy to keep it jiggling around.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
when you put this in video mode, and image stabilization is on, you might as well just watch your fuel gauge just go from full to empty while you shoot, because it really is going to suck up a lot of stuff there
It's
in
like
terms
a
of juice.
sport utility of cameras.
Yeah, well, it's that's what you get, and I also have the LCD set to very bright because I shoot out in the sunlight a lot, and that's going to make it worse. So it doesn't bother me. None of the cameras that have short battery life bother me because I'll just take extra batteries, and they're
You get
small,
extra batteries, and the batteries are relatively cheap, right?
relatively.
Well, what about charging? That was another ding that Sony used to get about batteries is they didn't come with chargers. You could still get, I think, aftermarket or third-party chargers, or even from Sony, you could buy a charger to plug into the wall so you can plug your battery in there. Especially considering you have to keep changing batteries all the time, you could keep one always charging and just keep swapping out if you're able to get to an outlet. What about this one? Is it still in-camera charging, or can you?
That's a good question because we got this from our friends at borrowlenses.com. They sent me a charger, so I don't actually know what comes in the kit. People will have to check that out. But our good friend over at Camera Labs, Gordon Lang, who does very, very in-depth reviews of the technology, he has a big thing about being able to charge in camera. He's a big fan of that, not as the only option, but as one option, because he'll be in a vehicle and want to charge in the vehicle. And if you're in a hotel room and you want to charge 2 batteries, you can charge one in the camera and one in a charger. This one does have in the body charging, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I certainly travel with 2 chargers because I usually go out with half a dozen batteries when I travel.
Yeah, it's like batteries in these Sonys are like the new film, right? Remember back in the old days, you used to travel with a pocket full of film just in case, Now it's, you got a pocket full of batteries just in case. So.
Yeah, the challenge now is with film, you could always tell which one was used because it was wound into the canister, right? But
that's right.
But here you don't know which battery is which, so I end up using my left pocket for fresh batteries and my right pocket for used batteries. These guys ought to put a little slider on there, sort of like the locks on an SD card or a CF card,
or a little LED that goes from red to green or something on there to let you know. That would be seems like battery technology needs to come, needs to catch up with camera technology.
Yeah, it does get a little annoying when you have to put the battery into the camera to find out how thoroughly it's charged. So anyway,
it would be smart if your battery was smart, so you could just look at it and say, even if it's an LCD, LCDs don't take that much power, right? The LCD on there with a little, little fuel gauge on it would be cool. What about the size of the sensor in here? Like, how big is it? How many megapixels?
It's a 24 megapixel. Again, the same sensor as the old Alpha 7. It is full frame. So the beauty, of course, is not only do you have Sony and Zeiss's full frame lenses, but you've also got all those gorgeous third-party lenses from Leica and Voigtlander and others that you can put on this puppy. It's really nice.
Love it. Okay, it's continuing with the sort of mechanics of this thing. The other thing that's important to us, like aside from that sensor, is shutter and shutter speed, especially the sync speed. If you're doing a lot of synchro sun and outdoor shooting, where you're trying to battle the sun and all that, how does it fare there?
I think the sync speed is a 1/250th of a second. I don't have that in my notes, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. The shutter is mechanical shutter or you've got the front curtain shutter can be electronic, so you can go into that mode. But as you remember, the Alpha 7s, all of them are criticized for having very loud shutters, and this is no exception. It's probably the
Oh, I remember.
same.
It was like a clunk if I
Well,
remember.
that's if you use the mechanical shutter both at the beginning and the end of the exposure, you'll get the double clunking. But in this case, you can put it on electronic shutter for the front curtain, and then you get one single loud clunk instead of two loud clunks.
Yeah, yeah. So you're in either case, you're not going to be stealthy with that guy if you're
No.
trying to tiptoe around. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So let's dive into the. First of all, how many frames per second on that?
Yeah, it's not real fast. It'll go 2.5 or 5 frames a second. You can select them, and it will autofocus in between those. So it's not bad, but it's certainly not up there in the 9, 10, 11, 12 frames a second that a lot of the sports and wildlife shooters want to have.
That's exactly what I was going to say. So the people that are like, I'm going to get this for sports and wildlife, you should probably look elsewhere, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. All right. Well, one of the big selling points of this guy is the in-body image stabilization. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it's they bill it as a 5-axis stabilization, so that's the normal 3 axes plus what is it, yaw, pitch, and roll. So it gives you that's your 5. So you got X, Y, yaw, pitch, and roll.
Yep.
When you put third-party lenses on it, like for example, if I take this really nice Leica 90 millimeter that I love to shoot with.
You love that lens, man.
Oh man, I've got a couple of Leica lenses. So you put that on, beautiful combination,
Yeah,
and now
cool.
I have an image stabilized Leica lens camera, and this is the only full frame camera I know of that will give me Leica lenses with image stabilization. You can put them on an Olympus and get this in micro four thirds, but you're not using the lens to its full advantage because you're not getting you're getting 180 millimeter equivalent field of view.
Right.
So if you want to shoot at slow shutter speeds and you want to use some of these Leica and other primes, this is spectacular. And in my experience, you know how they always say, well, how many stops better will it go because of the stabilization?
Mm-hmm.
For the Sony lenses, where they're using the 5-axis, Sony says it's 4 or 4.5 stops better. My experience, and that's, I'd say maybe that's about right, 4 stops. With these lenses, you're only getting the 3-axis stabilization, and I would say you're getting about a 2-stop difference. So if you could hand hold this lens at 100th of a second, 2 stops would be a 25th of a second that you could get essentially the same equivalent wiggling.
That's just magical.
Right.
That's
and I have shot
that kind of technology changes the way that you shoot in a lot of ways, doesn't it?
Yeah. Now I have shot to test it. I did a number of shots with lenses. I took a 15 millimeter Voigtlander out, and shot that at 1/4 of a second handheld and got perfectly sharp images. So pretty cool that you can do that.
Yeah, that's crazy. And you get $1,700 for that. Wow.
Yeah. That's pretty nice. So anyway, I would recommend if people want to check that out, go over to cameralabs.com where Gordon has done a very detailed comparison of with and without image stabilization. You can see what the effects really are.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So, it's and I would reiterate that. Head over to Gordon's page and check that out because it's until you see what it can do. And again, even after you go to Gordon's page to check that out, if you're really serious about plunking cash down to get this thing, I would rent it first. Rent it and play around with it, kick the tires and see if it's the right camera for you. Or maybe rent this one and one of the other A7 bodies to see which one fits you the best for your type of photography. All right, so we're inside the camera. Let's come outside of the camera and go around back. So the LCD, EVF, all that good stuff. How did that stand up to Doug's torture?
EVF is pretty much the same as the other one, which is good. It's not maybe up there with the electronic viewfinder that's in, let's say, the Fuji cameras.
Mm-hmm.
The LCD on the rear is generally the same. It's brighter than the A7. I'm not sure what they did, but Sony's done something to make it a little brighter.
Mm-hmm.
It will, of course, articulate. If I can.
Oh, it is articulating. I was going to ask that.
It tips. Oh, it doesn't articulate, but it tilts up It tilts
Yep.
down very nicely, and it's a touch screen.
Oh, it is touch,
Well, I'm touching it.
and nothing happened.
Nothing's happening. So you can touch the screen all you want. And let's
Yeah.
not get into that rant because we're going to, oh boy, are we going to get criticized on that
I
one.
know people are passionate about whether they hate or love touchscreens. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, they probably don't shoot video, and maybe they've never tried it because it's
Yeah.
one of those things that it's very addictive.
Yep. Okay. Cool. Well, I mean, so far it looks very ergonomic. I'm digging it.
Yeah.
What about the focus on that? The focus speed and is it faster or slower with all that in-body image stabilization than the A7?
Yeah, it's the exact same sensor technology in that they have 117 embedded phase detection points. So you get this hybrid autofocus. You're using the whole image area for contrast focus, and then you've got these 117 points that are clustered towards the center for phase detection. And the phase detection is particularly good for continuous autofocus.
Hmm.
The full frame contrast autofocus is great for things like face recognition, and this camera does face recognition very well. And if you turn it on to face recognition, this thing will do a great job of basically locking onto faces above and beyond all else. So if you want it to focus on something and a face walks in and it's turned on, it's going to jump to the face, which for a lot of shooting is the right thing.
Now,
Sony,
is it doing eye tracking, like nearest eye tracking as well, like some other cameras?
I don't think this one doesn't have that. This
Okay.
one doesn't have that, and if it does, we're going to hear about it in our comments. But I don't think this does. Face detection though works very well. Now the processing has improved. So Sony claims that this is 30% faster autofocusing than the original Alpha 7, and it does seem to be pretty good. The continuous autofocus on the original Alpha 7 is not terrific. So this works, but the superstar in the Sony line is still the Alpha 6000, and this is definitely not at that level. So
that thing, the A6000 still is the breakaway camera in that category. I think people when they get it, they love it and can't pry it from their hands once they get it. Now, do you own a A6000?
I do have an A6000. I love it. It went to Cuba with me. I took the A6000 and the A7S with me, and I had a great time with both of them.
Love it. Okay, we talked about autofocus. What about manual focus? Anything changed there?
Yeah, it didn't change technically, except for the fact that you've got this image stabilization, and particularly if you put like this 90 millimeter lens on there, and you try to manually focus something handheld, your camera is shaking normally, and so it's hard to focus something because, of course, you'll zoom in. You'll use the camera to zoom in on something far away. Well, with image stabilization, it means that it's stabilized while you're trying to focus. So now it's much easier to manually focus this camera because of the image stabilization. I really like that.
Everything's holding still for you.
Yeah, certainly much more than without.
Yeah. Now with manual focus, does it have focus peaking and all that good stuff?
It has great focus peaking, works very well, and again, whether you're using a Sony lens that can automatically jump into the zoom in mode, sort of the magnified mode for focusing, or you're using something like a Leica lens where you have to push a button in order to get into that mode, it really is great with focus peaking.
Love it. Okay, cool. All right, well, let's switch gears to video. These cameras kind of came into their own. I think it was the A7S that they announced that shot 4K, although externally you can't record 4K to the card, but it can record it to an external box. How does the video on this guy fare?
This video does not do 4K, so it's at 1080p, 60 frames a second, I believe. It's pretty good for video in that they've got HDMI outputs, they've got external mic and headphone jacks.
Awesome.
They've added an improved codec. It's the XAVC-S codec, which will give you a 50 megabit per second video stream. You do have to remember though to use the SDXC cards because you need a faster card to pump that video out. But no 4K in this yet. I don't know. We'll get there, I think.
Yeah. God, I want to see their roadmap. I want to see the Sony A7 Ultra. That is ultra light sensitive from the A7S that records 4K video directly to the card, has image stabilization built in, and a battery life of 24 hours or more per battery.
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking about this because we maybe need to do one or a few shows about generally how to select the cameras and help people understand what these product lines are like. You started off with a good description of the multiple Alpha 7 bodies, but the fact is that this is the best general purpose Alpha 7 camera, but you have the A7R, which is a high resolution camera, and you have the A7S, which is a high ISO camera.
Right.
And depending on what you're shooting, you may need one or the other, to solve your photography problems. And you're right. Wouldn't it be great for them to put them all together? I would like a 36 megapixel, high ISO, fast focusing, image stabilized camera in a small package. So
that shoots 4K to the card.
Oh yeah, that shoots 4K in the camera.
In the camera, yeah. Yeah, well, hey, you got to leave room for the next generations after us, right? So, all right, so let's talk about the connectivity options. I assume things are still the same, Wi-Fi, all that stuff?
Yeah, no change. Wi-Fi with NFC instant connectivity if you have Android. And of course, Sony has a different concept from everybody else. They have downloadable apps that you put into the camera. They have a store for them. Some of them are free. Some of them are $9.99 in US dollars. I'm not sure I really like this. To some extent, they're doing things through their store that other manufacturers do with firmware updates. But the fact is that they do have a few nice apps. They do have the standard remote that everybody has so that you can control the camera, take pictures, transfer them to the iPhone or Android phone.
Is it still bad? Because I remember in previous reviews, we talked about it compared to other cameras, and it was like at the bottom of the list in terms of the controls that it gave you and the ease of use and UI UX feel of it.
Well, because you reminded me, I did go back and check. So the fact is they've improved their remote. For example, the remote app on the iPhone is pretty nice. But this is still not up there with our favorite, which really is the Panasonic Lumix line, which I think for both of us has probably the best apps for mobile devices. But it's better. It's not an embarrassment that it used to be a year ago.
Okay, you can let it out into the front yard, but you're still not taking it anywhere.
Keep it on a leash.
Yeah, on a leash. What about NFC to tap to sync and all that stuff? Is that in there?
Yeah, it has that too. Of course, I can't test that because I'm an Apple guy, but it does have NFC.
Hey, your iPhone has NFC on it, but it's just locked down, so you can't use it for anything other than Apple Pay. So.
That's right.
All right.
Well, don't get me started on that. That's another show.
That's a whole nother rant right there. All right. Well, let's talk about the competition of this thing. This is the biggie, right? Because we get to this, and this is where here in the show and the ratings on the blog post that you write on This Week in Photo, all this stuff gets factored in together, and you come up with the rating. So where does this guy net out? Who's in the ring with the Sony A7 Mark II, right? Yeah.
The Alpha 7 II.
Alpha 7. Is it Alpha 7 II or Alpha 7 Mark II?
There's no mark in there.
What's the MK for?
That's just something I put in there to confuse you.
Okay. The Alpha 7 II. Okay.
And we're going to take a different tack, at least on this review and maybe on some of the future reviews. And that is, we're not going to compare this so much to other mirrorless cameras. We're going to say this is just a camera, period.
Yeah.
DSLR, mirrorless, the distinction doesn't matter except in terms of features. But the fact that it doesn't have a mirror isn't something we're going to worry about in comparing them. Because I think it's about time to outgrow the mirrorless distinction. I was looking at a website I like called The Wirecutter, which compares gadgets and tells you the best gadget to buy of this, the best gadget to buy of that. And they still have the best mirrorless camera. And I'm thinking, if I want a camera, do I really care if it's mirrorless? I really don't care, except that I want the features that a mirrorless gives me. Okay, So with that as a background, so here we've got a $1,700 camera. And this thing weighs a little over half a kilogram, 550 some grams. Let's start by looking at a serious competitor to this, which is the Canon 7D Mark II. So why is this a serious competitor? The Canon's only $100 more. The Canon is quite a bit heavier, almost a kilogram, 900 plus grams. But, oh God, here comes the mail. The Canon image quality is not nearly as good as it is in the Alpha 7 Mark II. Sorry, the Alpha 7 II. Now, that's my opinion, but it's also the opinion of many other reviewers, unless they're Canon fanboys. That's just a fact. It's just not there. And that's, if you look at noise, if you look at dynamic range, if you look at color rendition, the Alpha 7 really is better. Okay, so I think this beats the Canon camera, all other things being equal. And of course, then you have all the features that you can't get in a traditional camera.
Yep.
But a camera that I think is an even more serious competitor is the Nikon D610. That camera is only $1,500, so it's $200 cheaper than this one. The Nikon D610 might have better image quality than this, so that's a camera that you should consider. Because it's great. Again, 24 megapixels, good autofocus, lots of great features. So the 610.
But when you say, just to put a fine point on it, when you say image quality, there's a lot of factors that go into that besides just the sensor, right? Because it's the quality of the lens that's on that camera and all that. So are we comparing apples to apples, or like what's the measurement for lens?
I'm not including lenses, obviously, because even within a product line, lenses vary greatly. If I were to compare, the Sony 70 to 200 f4 to the Nikon 70 to 200 f4, that would be one thing. But I'm just looking at the sensor. All other things being equal, if you were to put the same lens on these two cameras, the D610 would have less noise in the final image. It would have a better dynamic range. And it would probably render colors more accurately than this camera, but not by a lot. Not by a lot. It's the D610 is a very good camera.
Yep.
And by the way, that D610 now is coming in at 3/4 of a kilogram, so it's 50% heavier than this guy, roughly.
Okay, got it.
Then you got the old A7, which I think you can still get, $1,300, same image quality as this camera. Just doesn't have all the bells and whistles. I wouldn't buy the A7. I think this camera is a much better camera.
Yeah. Would you consider the A7 as a backup camera?
If I had one.
Okay.
If I'm going to buy two A7s, I'd go for one of the specialties. I'd get, for example, the A7R at 36 megapixels for that tripod landscape kind of stuff, or I would get my favorite, which is the A7S, the high ISO camera. It's also the priciest at $2,500, so it's hard to say which is the backup, right?
Yeah, that's crazy. Okay,
so
it's the right tool. What's the right tool for the job, right?
Yeah, and for me, the A7S is one of my two go-to cameras. The other being the A6000. The A7S is a camera that, because of the high ISO, not only can I shoot in dark places, but I can go out and shoot on the street at high shutter speeds and small apertures, and let this thing run up to ISO 25,000. So I love that. But it's an expensive camera.
Yeah. Okay. So who else is
those are the real things. You could also look at, if you wanted to go to APS-C, you could look at the A6000. But again, within full frame, to me, the real competitor here is the Nikon D610. And for those people who want to stay in the Nikon line, I don't know that the A7 offers you enough. The Alpha 7 II offers you enough to switch. Although I love the cameras, the D610 is an awful good bargain for what it is.
All right. So I want to get into who this is for, but before I do that, I want to ask you, did you buy one of these cameras? You're in the Sony club already. Is this one, are you buying it, or is it on your wish list to buy in the near future?
It is not. I am not going to buy this camera. I have an S and an R, which I like very much, and I tend to use them in a more special purpose way. Mm-hmm. I would love to see the S with image stabilization. But let me tell you this. That's an important thing here.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's excited about the image stabilization. And for the purpose of review, I did go out and use it. I shot with that 15 millimeter at a quarter of a second. I shot with the 90 millimeter, at a 25th of a second, and it works. But here's the thing about image stabilization. Remember, it only fixes the problems with camera shake. If you're shooting a moving subject, image stabilization doesn't do anything about the motion blur.
That's right.
So if you're shooting a moving vehicle, a car or a bicycle with a 90 or an 85 millimeter lens, you're still going to want to go up to a 200th or a 250th or even a 500th of a second in order to freeze the motion. Now, if you're going to do that, you really don't need image stabilization.
Right.
So people need to understand that image stabilization really comes into play only for the slower shutter speeds, and that's only for a particular style of shooting and subject material.
Yeah, and if you're just trying to freeze things, yeah, your choice of going with the A7S with its ultra high ISO, you can just shoot at a faster shutter speed, right? and
that's
lock
it.
everything down.
Yeah, I'm not using the A7S because it's a night vision camera, although it is.
Yeah.
I'm using it because it allows me to shoot at high shutter speeds.
Yeah.
That's the big benefit. So, the question was, am I going to buy it? And the answer is no, and that's simply because of my personal style. If I were maybe a wedding photographer and I wanted to get some of those nice motion blur images at the wedding reception or something, as some people do, this would be a great camera. But this is not for my personal style of photography. So,
all right, well, we'll put on your B&H uniform. You're inside B&H. Someone walks up to the counter and they say, "Hey, Doug, I want to buy a Sony. I hear Sony's on fire with these awesome cameras, but I see a lot of numbers and models up there. I see the A7, the A7R, the A7S, the A6000, replace the A with Alpha, Alpha 6000, and now the newest one, the Alpha, 7 II. Too many bodies to choose from. Who is this camera for? How do I choose the right camera for me, Doug?"
Yeah, well, this is a terrific general purpose camera. What does that mean? That means it's going to do a good job for easy stuff, but it's not going to be the best camera for things at the margins. So it's not a great camera for action or sports. It's not good for high ISO situations, but it is a very good general purpose camera. And of course, it has the benefit of being terrific for slow shutter speeds and terrific for using third-party lenses, of which there are some amazing possibilities.
Yeah.
That's who this camera is for. So if you wanted a full-frame camera, if you want to stay with the Sony line, this is the camera to buy to get started.
It's going to lure you away if you had purchased that, which one was it? The Olympus OM-D E-M1, right? With their improved in-body image stabilization over the E-M5. And you're like, you know what? I heard all this noise about Sony. I want to move to Sony, but I like my in-body image stabilization. Is this the camera that they should kind of migrate over to?
From the EM1?
Yeah.
No. The EM1 is a spectacular camera.
Yeah.
And the only reason you go with the Sony over the Olympus EM1 is if you want the larger sensor, because other than the sensor size, I think the EM1 beats this camera in many categories.
Got it. Okay. So to answer the question of who this is for the general purpose. If you're a general purpose photographer, I guess, you want to be able to cover a lot of bases adequately, but none of them especially brilliantly. You go for this camera, right?
That's right.
But so this would be a good starting point if you want to not diversify, but go along a certain tangent and deeper into one particular area. Like, for example, you're doing a lot of low light, you need to shoot 4K, or you're a cinematographer, which is the definition of that. Or you're doing landscape photography and you need as many pixels as you can possibly get, then you go with the A7, the A7S on the cinematography side, etc. But if you're just jumping in, you're like, you know what, I just want to shoot, I'm a street photographer, I just want to, I need a regular camera. This is the one?
I think so, absolutely, and it's great for that. So that, yeah, this is, if you're doing yeah, exactly. Unless you need the high ISO or the faster autofocus and the faster frame rate, this is a great camera for you.
This is your general practitioner. If you need a specialist,
Right.
then you need to go pay the dollars for the specialist. But your good family doctor that knows a lot about a little about a lot of things, this is the guy for you. Right?
And before we let that go, let's point out that there are a lot of camera lines that only have the generalist stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at who else has a really high ISO camera, it's primarily Nikon with their $6,500 D4S, and
I can't even get my brain around that.
Yeah.
So.
And the Canon 1DX, which is also a very good high ISO camera. And if you want the better autofocus and frame rate, ironically, you go again to the D4X. Even the 5D Mark III is very good for that, for sports and action. But the other extreme, of course, is that little Sony Alpha 6000, which is for $450 is still killing it.
I can't believe that camera is $450. That's just that's crazy talk, man. It's crazy talk.
Soon, and by the time this is out, the Alpha 6000 may be announced, and I do not know what's in that camera, but I'm really
we're talking about the Alpha 6000.
Alpha 7000. Sorry.
Oh, the 7000. Oh,
Alpha
man.
7000. Yeah.
See, we were just talking about this on an episode of This Week in Photo. It was the latest. I think it was episode 398, and we were talking about the idea of this onslaught of new camera bodies that are coming out, and how the negative effect of that for a lot of photographers / artists is that you never really get intimate with the bodies. If you're on that gravy train of upgrading every couple of years or a year or whenever, you never really get to that level of muscle memory, intimacy with your cameras and your lenses maybe, but the camera bodies are almost kind of new always with you. You never break through that barrier, but hey, it is what it is. It's the age we live in, right?
Well, they say it takes about 10,000 exposures before you're really comfortable with the camera.
No one's getting to that.
I'm not going to have any sympathy for that because I get to keep them for exactly 2 weeks. So
yeah.
I'm not familiar with anybody.
Look at Thomas Hawk with his. I think he's shooting the Canon. I'm not sure what he's shooting these.
5D.
He put some mileage on his cameras, and you can look at his photos, and you know that he sees what the camera's going to do before he clicks the shutter. Because he has hundreds of thousands of clicks on that camera.
Thomas is one of the few people I know who actually goes through shutters.
Yeah.
Who has to get the shutter replaced before he gets a new camera. So that tells you something.
Crazy. All right, what's coming up next on All About the Gear, Doug? What do you got in the laboratories over at K-Labs?
I'll show you a little thing here. This is what I'm shooting with right now. It is the Fuji X100T, the third version of the X100, and so far loving it.
Hey now, so what's the deal with that? I don't want to go into the review, but that's fixed lens and manual controls and all the juicy love that is Fuji.
It's a 23 millimeter APS-C, so crop sensor, the equivalent of a 35 millimeter lens on a full frame camera. Beautiful controls. It has either, you can use it as a rangefinder camera or as an EVF or as sort of a hybrid. And this is a camera. The X100 was great. The X100S was spectacular and a very much loved camera. And this camera is even better.
All right. Well, I can't wait to hear all about it. What else? Anything else in the K-Labs?
That's all I'm talking about so far.
All right. Everything else is secret. All right. Cool. All right, Doug. I think that'll do it for another episode of All About the Gear. Fantastic job as usual. I think we got the folks watching this and listening to this have the lowdown on the latest in the Alpha 7. See, I got it right. Alpha, the Alpha 7 line, the Mark II or just 2. And it's a good general practitioner for your daily health needs, right? Yeah,
I think it was good. I think I wanted to cover two things that are very important. One was the idea that image stabilization doesn't solve all problems. And the other, this idea that it's really time for us to start considering these cameras not within just the world of mirrorless, but look at them relative to all other cameras. And that's, I think, what we're starting to do on the show.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to subsequent episodes. Cool, Doug. All right. Well, I guess we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Frederick.
Okay. See you, Doug.